it's one of these things. I know it's not a popular thing to say, um, but I have worked in the field of CSR and ESG, and there's a level of subjectivity to almost every measurement. Now, here's the thing: even for carbon, if you're talking about ISO 14000 series, for example, that may be an exception in terms of measuring scope 1 and scope 2. But when you get to scope 3 and you start kind of going out on the edges in terms of supply chains and assumptions and predictions about what these measurements may be, I think it's one of those things, back to lawyers and accountants basically not wanting to sign off. They may give an opinion, but at the end of the day, it's the founders who really have to make the claim. It feels like.
Welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, where we interview the top climate founders and VCs to get their best advice for you. In this episode, Silas and I chat with Zecca Lehn, GP of Responsibly Ventures. They back US PreSeed startups in both social and sustainable tech, and he uses the UN SDGs as a guidepost for his investments. In this, we break down the specifics of his investing thesis, including what he calls customer love and what it means to be ethical in investing. He's especially good at data and data reporting, so we heard a lot of really cool insights from him on how he uses data in his operations. We also dive into his experience as an impact investor, the good, the bad, and the ugly. As always, thank you so much for listening and enjoy the episode. Also, please take a second to fill out our listener survey in the description or our Substack. We're eager to learn more about you, what you do, and how we can help. Now, back to it.
All right, welcome to the show, everybody. Super glad to have Zecca here with us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. It's nice to be here in this little frame with y'all.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a pretty lively pre-show already. It's too bad you guys missed out on that. Maybe someday we should start recording these and giving them to subscriber only or something. But just tell us a quick intro to yourself. Give us a bit of background and what you're doing.
Well, sure. Like we were talking about, what inspires me about nature and the environment, and growing up on a small island is kind of my origin story around impact and sustainability. My father was a sustainable architect. My great grandparents had moved up to those Pacific Northwest islands a long time ago. Got me passionate about sustainability. I thought I was going to become a sustainable journalist of all things. I branched out, became an environmental economist, and I've been working in the clean tech, climate, sustainability, and social good space for nearly 25 years. And I try to be a catalyst as the GP of Responsibly Ventures. We're a pre-seed fund focused on investing in companies across the US. As an angel, I've invested about 50 plus startups. And long story, but it's been a lot of fun.
Shout out to our sponsors, Net Zero Insights. Net Zero Insights' mission is to enable the transition to a sustainable future by giving decision makers access to the leading market intelligence platform on climate innovation. Through the Net Zero platform, Net Zero Insights provides high-quality data and insights on the climate tech venture market by being the best at tracking organizations and funding rounds. I personally have had a great time using this to prepare for the podcast and researching companies, funding rounds, VCs, and the latest I need to know about the climate tech ecosystem. Use the link in our description to schedule your personalized demo with the team and claim your 10% discount. Thanks again to the Net Zero Insights team for sponsoring this show.
How did you end up, getting into this? Because you said that you didn't necessarily plan this in the beginning, but kind of tell us more about how you ended up here.
Yeah, well, like I said, I really thought I was going to become an environmental journalist, which many would say, like, what is that exactly? At the time, I thought I knew what that meant to me. So I went to college. I was pretty late in my 20s, and I showed up and I thought, well, the environment doesn't have great representation in general, and it doesn't necessarily pay a lot. So I'm not going into this for financial reasons, but I just feel really strongly that there needs to be a voice around the environment and how it can be, just sort of represented in another way. Obviously, you have things like environmental law or environmental policy or environmental science, environmental engineering. All these things help the environment on some level. But also journalists and content creators and investors and founders can do a lot to make a dent, I feel.
We are excited to announce that we have launched a Patreon. You can find this newly linked in our Substack and audio platform descriptions. We are both really just so grateful for each and every one of you and wanted to create a way to interact with you and for you to support us on our journey as we continue and try to talk to the best people doing amazing things in climate tech. We do all of this on the time we can muster outside of our day jobs, so any support means the world. Now, gushing over, back to the show.
And then so from there, like where did this end up taking you? Because I mean, you've invested in a ton
Yeah.
of companies, right? So I want to get to this
Yeah.
point, like where did you decide, hey, I'm gonna start investing,
Well,
and how did you actually
I could
make
give
that
you
happen?
like the type of story that gets formulated after doing a lot of podcasts and, being producing and content creation. But the honest truth of it is I didn't really know that being a VC was my path. It kind of fell into this world in a way that wasn't quite planned. And the experience really started I was in my early 20s. I had lived in Europe. I traveled a lot around the world, and I kind of decided that I wanted to take time and not necessarily go back to university and things like that, rather to get some world exposure. And I did that. I traveled to so many countries I couldn't even count, and had a really wonderful time working in my early 20s. And I decided I kind of got passionate about this idea of sustainable investing when I think it was somewhat emerging around the time when you had things like socially responsible investing. Even ESG really wasn't a term at the time. I thought to myself, I really like technical things. I like learning. I have a very curious mind, it feels. And I feel in the long run, I kind of want to be this sustainable investor. And so the best idea I could actually come up with at the time, because I really didn't have much benchmark to go by, who to speak to about. They didn't have a mentor. I probably should have had that, I guess. I thought, well, I'm gonna start an ESG hedge fund of all things. And I like markets and things like this, so I basically just set out, and I even didn't really set my university degree around it. I just said, in the long run, this is my goal. I'll give myself 20 years, and when I was in college, I actually still found a lot of interest in investing. I started this sort of like green ESG investing group at the university up in Washington State, and it gave us a chance to learn a lot about what is happening in, say, like SRI and or emerging ESG, looking at extra financial things like that. And we were just kind of like, what stocks to pick, what companies were doing good things that we thought we were aligned with, and we'd compete and do that. It was a lot of fun. It's probably like 5 or 7 of us. It wasn't even an official group at college, right? And so we're doing that, and this is some 15 plus years ago. But here I am. I'm sitting in a microeconomics class because it was a requirement, and I was bored. It was not for me, and I was thinking, this isn't really what I need to know, but I guess I'll stay open to it. And I just read this one passage in the book, and it was, yeah, I don't want to get into the details per se, but it was basically about this form of, we'll say, economic policy that many economists agreed with. And so I went to the professor and I said, "Hey, what is this thing by this person named Milton Friedman, this negative income tax thing?" And the professor just completely lit up, and they're like, "This is amazing. Every economist thinks this is an incredible rational economic policy, and you got to learn about this Milton Friedman person." And I was so excited about what they were talking about, and I thought, gosh, this person's really charged about economics. So I started researching more about this and learned a lot about the universal basic income, and also Milton Friedman, who was a monetarist but also a humanist, really, and his wife Rose, who invented this system. And basically it morphed into what today we know as universal basic income, or other forms of tax credit systems that are basically, you could say, they're kind of pro-social programs that are incentivizing entrepreneurial behavior, whereas many government programs, according to him and his research, show that bureaucratic systems that are less capitalistic don't necessarily give people the right incentives to improve their own livelihoods. And so I started thinking a lot about social impact and society and economics, and actually switched my degree into environmental economics, and I got a degree in that. And I said, now what? And so I was very ambitious to work in the field, but there really weren't any opportunities. I kind of scrapped my way into the industry. I started working for this firm that was, yeah, I don't want to go way too far back in all the weeds, but started working for this firm that was started around the 1970s with the Love Canal, which is when it's a hazardous waste site that basically this river caught on fire, and this company started in the aerospace industry way back in the 70s. And it was one of the most reputable. I got very fortunate to get a position there just by pure scrappiness. they gave me this job to work with a team of economists and some environmental planners, environmental engineers, and things like that. And I got to work on a lot of interesting projects across the country and the state, with private companies doing renewable energy projects, probably 50 plus companies, and kind of that branched out into a career in consulting, environmental and sustainable consulting, and also logistics and things like that. It was fun.
That is a really, really, really cool background.
You just never know.
I think you mentioned, especially knowing about sustainability as a kid and just being aware of it. Where do you think that came from? And I'm also curious if sustainability had a name, at that point in time,
Yeah.
or if it was just like caring about the environment or the planet or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So my parents, they were a kind of product of the 60s. And with that new form of social and civil unrest, I think, and just innovation experimentation, many people decided that society wasn't necessarily moving in a direction that was good for the planet. And so for them, it was a little bit like, let's go move to this small island. Let's, I grew up in this DC powered home off the grid in the rainy Northwest, and we literally have to like go up on the roof and clear solar panels off the roof, and the light bulbs were like basically like candlelight growing up. It was pretty intense. A DC powered TV, if you've ever heard of that before.
I
It was
have
pretty
not.
wild. Canadian TV, we got that. That was awesome. And so my dad was a sustainable architect, in the sense that he was one of the first developers on the West Coast to work with passive solar condominium complex in the early 80s, when Carter put solar panels on the White House. So sustainability, where does it or where is its origins from? I would really give it credit for the conservation movements that have spanned many decades, even going back to the Great Depression, and conservation in general, adherence to nature. I wouldn't necessarily claim that that's the origin, but the United Nations themselves, they've established their definition of what sustainability means for at least 20 plus 30 years now. And I tend to feel that that's the best objective around meeting goals that are greater than any national goals.
And I think it's the whole concept of sustainability existing, kind of taking form. A lot of it was about initial regulation and righting some wrongs, and this is a very not so great process that's happening theoretically.
Yeah.
Now you're up in
Well,
a situation where,
ironically, it
yeah,
was
yeah,
Nixon who formed the EPA, who was a right
yeah,
wing Republican.
yeah.
But I think actually I think that the United Nations may have actually started their sustainability efforts before that, actually, and I mean that may not have been formalized into any standard programs, but I think they probably had some exposure to that in development economics or something like that, which is also sustainable in that sense.
I think it's really interesting to see where that now meets the inspiration behind what you're investing in. Because I think for people, when they invest in sustainability, you run, again, an early stage fund, made a lot of
Yeah.
investments. So you're seeing things not just in sustainability, but in social good. So I'm
Mhm.
curious, especially to set the scene for the audience, how did you then
Yeah.
take that from a mainly sustainability focused mindset, and to our understanding, maybe it's different, but also then included that social good aspect of it in your investing thesis?
Well, it's actually safer to assume that sustainability is both social, environmental, and economic. And so if you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a proxy for a goal set around sustainability, there's 17 UN SDGs. And you'll see that they're, I mean, I should probably actually pull them up, because they're great to just as a reminder what they're focused on: land, oceans, clean water, clean or public health, basically, sustainable consumption, poverty, health and wellness, things like that. These core categories are all gearing toward a more sustainable planet. Now, when I say planet, I don't necessarily mean ecosystems, or I don't necessarily mean ecosystem services. Planet can also be encompassing of economic health as well. So think about jobs and displacement in regards to offsetting. Let's say we were talking about logging in the pre-show. There are always considerations in regards to economic impacts that are multi-factor, that aren't necessarily just about climate. They're not just about clean water. They're not just about social good aspects, economy, etc. And so that holistic view on impact in general, it does give me a lot of flexibility as a thematic sustainable investor, which I think is, for our fund strategy, is very wise because, for example, I was part of the clean tech movement, we'll call it. And there were many aspects of clean tech that look more like envirotech, or they look more like industrial tech. Maybe today, climate tech may look like that on some level, but I think there's a lot more software and data and AI and things like that. And we could get into that if you'd like. I don't mean to derail the conversation. Hopefully
No,
I
no,
answered
yeah.
the question.
I think it was the perfect segue because you mentioned fund strategy and your
Yeah.
investing strategy tangent to that. One of your statement pieces that you look for is customer love, is what you call it. So when we were doing
Yeah.
when we prep for this, I noticed that. So I want to ask you about it. What is customer love, and what have been
Yeah.
some of the cool stories about ways you've seen it?
Well, I mean, people vote with their feet. And so what does that mean? People decide what they want. And in a free economic system, people will pay for what they want and they'll demand it. If you're not willing to build it for whatever reason, then you're out of business. Now, whether or not you can align the customer's motivations with your own mission is a really challenging question. And so we do look for opportunities that do both. Really it's going back to the fundamental principles around scaling a business. What do your customers need? What's the real problem? What do they want? How are you going to scale the solution around that? And my job is really to be opportunistic around finding opportunities that have that as the core tenet. So customer love, I mean, it's kind of an old fashioned thing. It's like, getting on customer service and so there's someone there to actually listen and care about your problem and actually maybe provide some valuable, feedback and things like that. I like founders who are very centered around caring for their customer, not just their own version of the problem.
Kind of continuing on that in terms of what you look at, another two parts that really caught my eye were ethics and honesty. So what does that look like in from an investing lens?
Yeah, well, so from an investing lens, it's very case by case dependent, in my opinion, because really ethics is just a word, just as honesty is a word. Opacity, transparency, all these are words that mean different things to different people at times. Now, mostly we can agree what is ethical. Stealing is obviously illegal; that's unethical. But there are other categories that are a little complicated. So let's say, for example, you're a startup making an impact in different areas, but there are certain areas where you could branch out into that are very opportunistic, that have, let's say, ethical gray areas around. Let's just, for example, one we like to pick on, um, uh, let's say Juul, the vaping cigarettes. Now, I don't want to make any claims. I won't make any claims. No advice in the show, et cetera, et cetera. This is all just ideation. But this category, if you were with a limited set of knowledge in a time where cigarettes and smoking was observationally highly correlated with cancer, and Juul comes to market and say, look, we have this very great solution. That's just this vaping pen. It's perfectly harmless. Yes, it's nicotine, but you can also get that in gum form. It's not going to damage your health. So, well, it's off to the races, right? There's really no conflict there. But unfortunately, no one could necessarily see the writing on the wall with Juul. And one thing that couldn't have been foreseen there, I saw this recent documentary with the Juul story, was, okay, so they had aftermarket cartridges that were used by people to save cost on the nicotine. And those aftermarket cartridges had flavors, and those flavors had vitamin D in them. And so some heavy Juul smokers were inhaling these things with aftermarket product, right? And they were getting I think it was vitamin E, I believe, vitamin E in their lungs. And there were many like young people that were hospitalized because of it. And so not only do you have an addictive product that is in the I would call it the vice category very explicitly, but you also have these we'll call them impact category, or channels they can take that aren't necessarily great channels to take. Now, we couldn't have foreseen that, but in the case of Juul, it's quite easy what is, in my mind, what is ethical here, because you have a clear category that many institutions will define as vice, so tobacco. But it gets a lot more difficult when you're talking about AI, climate, and privacy, for example, farmers' privacy, or other things that are difficult to quantify when you first look at a deal.
On the topic of quantifying things, this is something that I've noticed throughout your writings and your content and generally, is that you seem to take a very data driven approach to this.
Yeah.
And given that you are investing in impact, and it's kind of a broader category for you, let's say less nuanced than some funds, where they really restrict themselves. How do
Impact
you do
clauses.
that?
We don't do
Yeah.
impact clauses with our founders.
Yeah. So how do you can you just explain your data driven approach and what
Yeah.
that means and how you quantify it to
Yeah.
say, hey, this is an impact investment that we're
Yeah.
willing to make and here's why.
So I'm taking a different approach around impact that is slightly different. So here's the thing. I'm a former environmental economist. I was a data engineer, a data scientist. I'm certified in the United Nations Global Reporting Initiative. I have 20 plus years in sustainability. I have the right to talk about things with some authority based on my knowledge. And that knowledge gives me an ability to be more experimental without, let's say, being accused of being a greenwasher. So, greenwashing is a very charged term that has a few legal cases that have been established. But I've said, look, instead of trying to avoid any uncomfortable conversations about what is greenwashing and what isn't, for example, I'd like to leave it to the founders to be strategic about how they report their voluntary information to me, and let them make any claims they feel that is comfortable for their business. Now, the problem with that is, for example, it conflicts with some other approaches where the fund managers are seen as making claims, which I am not in the business of doing. I'm not in the business of making claims for our founders. I would never want to represent them by claims. Now, however, if they feel comfortable and I feel like I think it's a great idea, if they want to share some impact metrics with us that we pass through privately to our LPs or we put on our website, all great. But there's absolutely no. I'm basically tearing off the layer of social, whatever you want to call it, social discomfort, and I'm saying, look, instead of being so sensitive about how things need to be measured as terms of standard metrics, which I believe, frankly, we won't achieve it. We will not achieve some standard level of metrics. It's a fool's errand. So I've said, instead of that, let's not fool ourselves. Let's really look at this. These are founders who are telling us what their observational statistics look like, and let them present it to us. There's no BS here. We're not like pretending as though we're offsetting, homelessness. We're not offsetting a homelessness. There's no second world we can compare it to. It wouldn't be ethical. So instead of that, I just say, look, they can report what they will. I can report it back to my LPs. But also, here's what's actually interesting. I've said, as a fund manager, I can report by choice what I will report to our LPs strategically. If I think it's too material, or if I think there's too many competitors early on that may, or if it's something that may be too sensitive for some people to see because they don't have information rights or whatever, I just don't want to put our founders at risk. So our LPs at Responsibly Ventures give me discretion to report impact metrics as a secondary. Now, the question is, why are we doing that? And why am I being so open about it? The reason I'm being open about it is because we are a finance first, 100% aggressive. Sometimes I jokingly say I'm a greedy impact investor. And I actually mean that, that I'm looking for impact that does great in the world, obviously the way you see it as a founder, and the way that I have kind of skeptically examined. And of course, the market's going to test what it does, and your customers are ultimately going to tell you what deserves to live in the world. But so here's this basically screen. But my job is not to make claims on their behalf. Just back to that my job is simply to attract people based on a shared interest. but really it's to filter out opportunities that I don't think will return excellent ROI to our LPs. The LPs come first in terms of returns. And many of our LPs, they're not very sensitive about impact. I'd say maybe half incredibly, it's first and foremost. Some of them don't even care about returns. But I just tell them, like, my job is my job is, because I'm a co-investor in our fund, my job is to get exceptional returns. I sometimes call it like unapologetic returns or something like that. It's fun. So
I think this is quite interesting that nobody, I've never heard anybody talk about it this way, where
I'm
you
aware
have
of it.
specifically drawn a line to say that we don't want to represent, because is this due to any, I've heard this, I'm really uneducated on this, so I might be
No
asking
legal
a
advice
silly
in this
question here.
podcast either. Did I mention that?
Yeah, exactly. But is there some kind of recent law in California about making
Yes.
claims? Is that why you've kind of had a sensitivity towards this, or is this
No,
just
no,
something
no.
that you kind of philosophically
Actually,
believe?
what I saw in Europe with SFDR, SFDR program, I think is a little bit. I think it's not necessarily the right direction for a capitalistic society.
Hmm.
So yeah, the problem of corporatism always comes into the conversation in my mind. And what good is a bureaucracy? Well, bureaucracy, Milton Friedman would have always said bureaucracies are very good at protecting themselves, and people people like to be in a comfortable bureaucracy. And I've lived in Europe, and I understand. I mean, you have government subsidies for not only funds but startups and things like that, which we don't have to the same degree in regards to direct grants. It's very rare.
I think
There
your
are some
position.
exceptions to that. There are some exceptions to that, though, in the U.S.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I just wanted to, before we moved on from that specific topic, I think not only your position in front of all of this data from your founders, from the people that you manage, but also in the impact space. I'm curious if you've ever interacted with any newer technologies related to privacy and information exchange. The reason is because I
Yeah.
think venture is a very stagnated industry. So
Mhm.
and I don't think I'm
Yeah.
offending anyone
No.
by saying this. I think other,
No. No.
other GPs and LPs who are funding these VC firms will say that. One of the interesting things that's come to mind is, how do you be more data driven in your venture
Hmm.
investing? I was talking to
Yeah.
an investor out of LA the other day, and he takes sort of the writing scripts to diligence and then collect data and use that data. And
Hmm.
so he's very data forward. But a
Yeah.
lot of other VC firms, one of the interesting dynamics that I hear is that LPs don't care about data. They care about returns. And I think you're talking about that dynamic. So that's why I want to double tap on it. Do you
Yeah.
think there's tension between you and your LPs when you end up in a situation where you're giving more data than you need? And how are you going through that
Yeah.
feedback mechanism?
Yeah. There's this thing called information rights and management rights and things like that. We don't require that as well as a pre-seed fund. Frankly, in terms of impact reporting and data, we actually we're going to publish our first annual diversity report, which I'm incredibly proud of as our fund, and then also our first impact report, and I'm super proud of that as well. And it's all voluntary again. Actually, we preempted the new California diversity law, but also on the impact side, really there is no gold standard in terms of standardizing impact metrics across all the sub goals of the UN SDGs, other than what someone could choose themselves, and that's strategic. But back to your data question, many institutional investors for larger funds, especially European funds who have a strategic advantage with a financial strategic advantage, do in fact require like uh, impact clause level data that is audited as well, and that is expensive. So even if we were to say, like, okay, you need to be a B Corp if we're going to invest in you, that can be also costly. I've heard anywhere up to about $100,000 per year just to stay B Corp certified. And when you think of a pre-seed opportunity, a pre-seed startup, or even a seed-based startup, they are grinding hard, they're burning fast, they're maybe cash flow positive year 2, year 3. There are 3 months of runway remaining. They may have to pivot in any given moment. They don't want 100 investors with 100 different platforms sending them 100 different queries every quarter. I mean, it would literally eat up one person's time 100%. And
Totally.
I don't want to encourage that because I think it's anti-innovation, frankly.
I totally agree. I mean, I think that's one of the I've always been super amazed when I'm on the VC side, or sending out these big requests for data. As I
Yeah.
would think as a founder, I would hate to get that email.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I don't want to be that person either. They're so they're really in survival mode, and that's not to say that they don't want to track things and they don't want to measure things. I would say, I think out of all of our respondents, something like 60% are already tracking impact metrics at PreSeed, which is awesome. But we're not talking about like third party validated or standardized systems because frankly, I mean, go into the weeds, but and I don't want to give before we publish and such, but
right.
um, there really are
Give us the
there
inside
really are
scoop.
very there really are no standards and frankly, it's one of these things. I know it's not a popular thing to say, um, but I have worked in the field of CSR and ESG, and there's a level of subjectivity to almost every measurement. Now, here's the thing: even for carbon, if you're talking about ISO 14000 series, for example, that may be an exception in terms of measuring scope 1 and scope 2. But when you get to scope 3 and you start kind of going out on the edges in terms of supply chains and assumptions and predictions about what these measurements may be, I think it's one of those things, back to lawyers and accountants basically not wanting to sign off. They may give an opinion, but at the end of the day, it's the founders who really have to make the claim. It feels like, and
Mhm.
and again, like, are they willing to? Do they want to put their companies in a position of cost and liability? Probably not. So I wonder who will do that at sub $1 billion companies.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm curious just to kind of like point something in specific. I know that especially for certain metrics, a big issue is also trying to piece together. This happens a lot in B2B marketplaces, for example, trying to piece together which metrics matter. And that's a
Yeah,
big concern, which is, you're asking the
yeah,
founder for a bunch of things and you realize most of them didn't matter. Or you don't do anything with it. I mean, as
yeah,
a data scientist, I'm sure you know, I'm a computer
yeah.
scientist by background. I mean, data doesn't mean anything if you're not using it, right? I'm
Oh
curious if
my.
there's been a data set or like a specific question that's actually been surprisingly useful in guiding your investing retroactively.
So investing is always an art and less of a science, in my opinion, especially private investing, because you have a lot of probables and ifs, maybes, what ifs. Especially the earlier you go into hypothetical world. And I look at pre-seed investing as ultra speculative. That's actually how I pitch my LPs. I say, hey, are you ready to put some money into the ultra speculative bucket? Just to make sure that they understand that it's really, really risky. But anyway, so around the impact metrics in general and the garbage in, garbage out problem. Um, Now, for ESG, it's pretty well established in terms of, let's say, the UN's Global Reporting Initiative. What are some standard metrics that apply to those governance, social, and environmental? Okay. But like I said, many of them are subjective. And so with that subjectivity, the question then, I'm just going in circles here. You're going to always have subjective, even in the public markets with companies that can afford 500K budgets per year. They have to have subjective metrics included. And that's probably why the IRS does not want to be the accounting, you know, agency of record for these extra financial aspects.
Yeah. One thing, this is the VC topic sometimes beyond me because someone understands it better. So one thing I wanted to ask about, going back to, is you mentioned something about privacy and AI concerns, and I haven't really heard anybody
Sure.
talk about this. So could you
Yeah.
just let us know what are your main considerations when you're looking at something that's an impact investment that involves AI? What is the main consideration that you think about, or considerations, when it comes to privacy and information security?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I wish I had like a perfect answer on it. I'll do my best. How about that? I think if we were in a HIPAA environment, that would probably make the world very easy. If there was a HIPAA equivalent for, let's say, small businesses or small going concerns. but it doesn't really exist. If you had something like a homomorphic encryption system, that would probably solve part of the problem. But fact of the matter, I think, remains that data is valuable and information is valuable, and some businesses are sensitive to that. They're very sensitive to it. I listened to a podcast some years back. I wish I could pull up the name and such, but the podcast I listened to was talking about farmers, the small farmers, and their sensitivity around their crop and data. If you think of surge pricing, basically in a small market where there's really not access to a large number of providers, that may be something that farmers are skeptical about, and rightfully so. I mean, so if you're asking them to share their information, for example, and you're not providing SOC 2 or these other expensive types of HIPAA style compliance systems, it can be a hurdle. It can be a real hurdle to some who are very guarded about how their businesses are treated, in my opinion. That's not advice, though. That's just food for thought. No pun intended.
No. So broadly speaking, you're just trying to think past kind of just looking at the business model. You're just thinking, okay, how do these people consider their own data? And is this something that we want to put them in a circumstance where they may not want this stuff to be shared? Is that kind of like a general theme that you would
founders
use?
are 100% in control always, in my mind. And, really, if they want to make a cigarette company, they probably could. They could turn a climate company into a cigarette company. I couldn't stop them. Now, would I want to support them? Would I want to stand by their side and provide intros if they're selling cigarettes? No, I would not. Maybe in a hypothetical situation like that, it's not really a fair situation, but truly they are in control of their outcome. And so that's really the job. The job as a VC, in my mind, is to understand, what is it do I get about this business, and where do I feel this may be going based on my knowledge and also what they're sharing, and to assess whether or not it's a believable story. And if that story's believable, then I just get behind them 100%. It's really that simple. It's rinse and repeat all day long.
I'm going to do a not very good transition here, but talking about where these companies go, one of the really, really cool things that I learned working in early stage investing is how powerful a dynamic with good follow-on investors can be, right? So if you're a good seed investor and you have seed and Series A and Series B, investors at the table, how much that really, I don't know if there's data behind it, speaking of data, but it really does empirically change your likelihood of success. And so I just want to ask, maybe at a high level, because you probably can't summarize sustainability and social good all in one statement, but how do you think about,
I'm ready for it. Let's do this.
Yeah. How do you think about and how do you communicate your portfolio as attracting follow-on investment? Like, what are the unique challenges and strengths of being a sustainability and social good VC?
Well, again, I can't make any forward-looking statements. However, a good VC, in my mind, is one that returns a bucket loads of money to its LPs. I'm biased toward the finance side of the equation, and again, I'm simply taking a thesis approach to finding an edge in a market on a financial basis. So that is my goal. My goal is to capitalize on a certain set of knowledge around sustainability and impact. And the thesis we have is that we can outperform funds of a similar early size financially. That's the thesis. I can't make any claims around that, but that's the thesis. Whether or not we do or not, that's the gamble. That's the risk. And I absolutely love it. I wake up every single day, and just as an indicator, so as an angel, 3 consecutive years on a 10 to 12 bet per year on paper, just estimated, I hit top decile among US VC. Top, what's the 5 tile, the quintile, or the top? So, I mean, but that's just on paper, and it's benchmarked against a baseline year. And I used a sample of about 200-300 funds. And of course, that's an estimate. And it's a long game in venture. You have to consistently show up, try to, create diversification, try to create opportunity. I would like to share a little bit about that, but I don't want to derail the conversation. I love building community, and I love media in order to attract new talent to our firm and our community. And it just drives a virtuous cycle. I found it to be such an incredibly powerful, what you both are doing is basically just driving opportunity to your focus, which is awesome. It's super powerful. Excuse
This
me.
is something I did want to talk about actually, which is when we actually connected through Twitter originally, or X, whatever you
Yeah.
want to call it.
X
Yeah,
Twitter.
X Twitter. I don't even know. It's kind of so confusing. But the point is,
Whatever.
we connected there, and I just remember we jumped in a call at one point, and I was super
Yeah.
kind of just blown away by how present you seemed. I mean, despite being extremely busy all the time, like you just jumped off a call and you had only 30 minutes to chat, but you were very present with our conversation. And
Thank
this
you.
kind of plays
Thank you.
into the thing you talk about, community building, right? So like
Yeah.
just as like more of a personal thing,
Sure.
how do you remain keeping that mindset, like to stay present? Because it's easy if you're going as intensely as you are with 12 investments a year
Yeah.
or whatever. How do you do that?
That's a really good question. I wish I had a recipe for this. I actually got a book rec today, which is helping me with this. I feel it's an incredible book. Have you both read "Can't Hurt Me" by David Goggins?
No, but I did see that you posted about it.
Oh gosh, I mean, one of our founders shared this, and David is kind of like he's like a machine. He's just a machine, and staying focused. I think both Bill Gates and Warren Buffett agreed that focus is the thing that they both share as the success to their careers. I think focus is really the core to any success in any venture, frankly. Having a system to focus. I was getting off a call earlier today with one of our founders, and thank you for the kind words as well, by the way. Getting off the phone with one of our founders earlier today, and just a high level paraphrase, just setting up systems to me seems to be very important. Whether it's like, for example, we ran in the community this thing called the GEMS Challenge, which is gratitude, exercise, meditation, stretching, 10 minutes a day. Each community member gets one gem when they complete 10 minutes or more per day. We ran it for 3 months, and somebody won with a nonprofit prize. It was awesome. But that simplifying things, keeping yourself grounded, both mentally, emotionally, physically, and, still maintaining healthy relationships with their family members and things like that. It's just a balance. I think I'm still learning. I think there's a lot to learn for all of us. Frankly, I think we're all very busy.
Yeah, I find it very difficult I mean, I'm not the only one. I know there's other people who really like working in climate can be stressful depending on like some of the
Yeah.
circumstances. It's not always
Yeah,
rosy, right?
climate anxiety. I
Yeah.
don't suffer from climate. I don't suffer from climate anxiety myself. General anxiety is another story
Yeah.
altogether, but we can tack that one on as well. No, it's not. I mean, it's not funny if someone's suffering. There's always a place where everyone can get help and all that stuff. Um, but climate anxiety in particular has, I think, its roots in catastrophic cognitive science, perhaps, and picking something to obsess about cognitively could be a part of that. I'm not a psychologist. I just play one on TV, quite literally. But no, I think, just looking at the bigger picture, going back to, for example, where did sustainability stem from? I always tell people, I say there's going to be multiple overlapping cycles of sustainability: climate, water, population. Just go back to Malthus. Malthus lost the bet. The world is actually getting better. The statistics show that the world has been getting better for hundreds of years. Now, climate may be an exception to that, but I think we're going to see a period where we solve the climate problem, and then it shows back up again for, I don't know, for whatever reason. And I think it's important to not necessarily overplaying the optimism card, because optimism will not solve problems in and of itself, in my opinion. But I think just taking perspective on these things that are catastrophic are important to consider and to think deeply about and to attach one's purpose to. But I think the important thing to reconcile is that there are people that have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of causes that are personal to them. And they're all meaningful and they're all important. And judging if one person's cause is the trump card to purpose is a fool's errand again. I do not think that that's the way to go. Now, if you feel as strongly as you do about climate, good for you. But remember, you're going to connect with others who have other purposes. They're building other nonprofits. They're building other ventures. They're investing in similar areas. So I like to think of myself as like sometimes the VC impact of Switzerland style person, a little bit less emotionally attached. Now, economists, they say it's the dismal science. And I always tell people, an environmental economist, you could call it the depressing science, but it doesn't need to be that. Actually, it can really be hopeful in the sense that, you know, each person's motivation and action can make a difference, and frankly it will. I'm 100% confident that if each of us made more actions, it would actually make more positive impacts.
Mhm.
I'm 100% confident in that.
Yeah. One thing I just want to comment on is I think that for me, it's not so much of climate anxiety, but more so like the kind of people refer to the in the solar world, the solar coaster, right? Like it's not always like
Yeah,
it's not everybody is always interested in it like it was 2020 or
that's right.
2021. But
Or
to
1982.
yeah, to go back to kind of this theme you talked about at the beginning is that you're just focused on returns, right? If we want this to be a constant,
Returns
yeah,
first.
if we want this
Because
to,
in
yeah, go
mhm.
ahead.
Because returns have been thought of as secondary and almost ethically misaligned with purpose. And I think that's also a thinking error,
Yeah.
frankly. And that's one I've been working on actively to try to correct. Now, maybe in 70% of the cases where you have strong causes, that it's more appropriate for something to be a nonprofit or to be something that is sort of a revenue style, private equity style business, or even an SMB. That may be the case. But my thesis here is that you have funds and you have startups that can become, let's say, the next Teslas or the next other disruptor that is going to make exceptional positive returns that will beat out the Fords, and it will beat out the Chryslers and the whomevers.
Yeah. The thing,
I'm very focused on that
yeah,
very narrow set.
I just think it's quite fascinating though, because all of these things, if we want it to become part of the, part of the furniture where it's like, it's not, we don't have to worry about interest in climate going away. It would have to be tied to returns, right? Because that's not something that's going to change. People are going to want returns. So if we can focus on that and make all of what we're building and what we're investing in, make that the focus, there should be less of the waves and it should be, a little bit more like kind of with the rest of the
Right.
economy is my opinion.
I think it's a good opinion. I think the only caveat to this is that resources matter.
Mhm.
And, for example, I think Bjorn Lomborg would be a case of saying, look, we're being irrational with the level of spending allocated to climate. I'm not going to agree or disagree with someone like him. I'm not aligning with any sort of rationalization. I'm just suggesting that here's the logical fallacy. And I think I've done a little bit of soul searching on this one, and I think I can come up with a tangible thesis I'll share with you about. I agree with you that this is important, but the problem with this, we'll call it worldview, in my opinion, and just this opinion this is not an ad hominem, by the way. I love that you're being open with me. I think the problem is that when you compare something like, let's just take for example, mutanogens, which are ecological mutanogens in an ecosystem where there are no humans, and let's say it's isolated from humans. Okay, just to take a control. If you look at, let's say someone, mutanogens were dropped out of the sky into a basin, and that was a closed basin. Water was never going to meet humans in any way, and we're talking about a preserved place where hardly anyone can access. Sorry. So take this controlled area, and then the question is it better to spend money on controlling the mutanogens? That's a hard word for me to say. Is it better to control the mutanogens in this area versus, for example, alleviating 10 people in poverty in a developing nation? So there's a social cost to both, and you can measure what is the social cost to both. You can do all sorts of fancy, externality research, positive and negative externalities, and look at what is the multiplier effects, yada yada yada. We can do that. We can compare the social cost, which is purely price-based mechanism as environmental economics. That's what we do professionally. We can do that, or they could do that. I'm no longer practicing, but I was at one point, so I'm speaking more hand waving at this point. But let's say you could do that. Now, if you had let's say you had a benevolent dictator, for example, and that benevolent dictator were deciding one choice versus the other because the budget had to be allocated, it would be an unethical choice to make, I believe. Because if you're simply looking at price and social costs from the standpoint of the systems that provide economic value, then you have to go to some other form of rationalization, which is to say, this is something we can't measure, and therefore we have to go by our emotional choice here. We cannot include some sort of economic price comparison between these two things. So what happens? You see a lot of emergent behaviors like effective altruism, or even here's a fun little logical puzzle. You see things like Elon Musk making claims about the S&P 500 ESG ratings and saying, why is Tesla rated with a lower ESG score than, say, something in a completely different industry? Well, that's because you're comparing apples to oranges. You're not comparing apples to apples. You're not comparing the next car company that produces whatever volumes adjusted basis on an external basis, such as an ESG system. That's not intellectually as honest as one could be, in my opinion.
That this topic, I mean, the way that you quantify these things and think about these things, effective altruism is, of course, you mentioned one camp. I wish we had the time to go into this. I feel like we opened up a whole nother podcast recording.
I really don't mean to get political. I think economics can be not political.
No, but I think it's extremely topical. I think, like, especially we've had a lot of shows on philanthropy recently.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely worth talking about. And I think as the types of investing in climate diversify, so does the understanding of what are we expecting as a net societal and environmental return. That literature in our own, like, verbiage and conversations needs to go up, because it's not just, even though we spend the entire episode talking about returns first, at the end of the day, when it gets to measuring the impact and what we're doing, I think it's good to have many different points of views.
Yeah, indeed.
I wish we could keep going, but the thing that we really love to end on, last question I'd love to pose to you.
Yeah.
I think this is especially relevant to you as an early stage, pre-seed, early stage investor, is if you had to stop investing, basically someone came and take your job and they said, build me a company in climate. What specific area or subsector of climate would you build it in, and why?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think it would be a profitable one, but I would like to do some sort of service to desertification. Like the Green Belt in Africa, I think is an incredibly important and awesome project. And I think they're learning a ton with that. I think that could be a market-based solution that could exist if it had the right participants. I don't know whether or not it could scale on such a large, they're literally building like this green belt across, like say 3,000 miles across the Sahara. And I think it's amazing. Desertification is something that can be solved, and they're working on it there. And obviously I think it'll catalyze a lot of opportunities, but something like that I would do.
That's fascinating,
Okay.
by the way.
Rapid
I
scale
thought
is
about,
one of your...
Yeah, that's actually really fascinating. I thought about this. I think I forget what the movie was. So there's a kind of documentary on this guy who did something in the desert, and they were able to get rain. Tully, or
can you share that with me? I would love to watch that.
I'll get it for you. Yeah. It's
I
really good.
I read a book like 20 plus years ago. I think it was Colin Fletcher or someone. He was a colonel, and his whole life was dedicated to desertification. I've yet to find the book. I actually need to own it again, but I found it at the library. It's just so fascinating.
But that's really cool. That's a very unique idea, and I appreciate that, because just think about, it's essentially like taking an unviable place and making it viable. That's quite interesting. But anyways, this has been a really fun conversation. I think. I don't know what Somil thinks.
Thank you both.
The same. But we really appreciate you coming on. I love it.
You guys are great at interviewing. I appreciate your time, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's our pleasure.
Awesome, guys. Okay, bye for now.
If you've made it to this point in the episode, thank you so much. You are the first to listen to our first iteration of our takeaways. And this is basically a place where Silas and I would love to tell you about our favorite parts and what we're thinking about from the episode. So for mine, what I really found interesting about Zecca was first his approach and clarity around data to LPs. This is one of those aspects in venture that doesn't really have a playbook, but it's becoming increasingly important in impact reporting and GHG reduction reporting. So being focused on that, I'm sure will be a strength to Zecca when talking to LPs and other sustainably minded investors. Second, Silas, this is actually something that you talked about, but you having had the impression that Zecca was so focused on you when that was happening. This is a characteristic that I'm actually learning from the How to Take Over the World podcast. Quick shout out, I'm a new fan, have binged almost every episode. This is something that is apparently a common trait amongst the greats of the world, including Steve Jobs. So I think this is a really, really cool thing that he emulates this quality. And the last thing is maybe less about what we talked about in the episode, but his point about focusing on desertification in Africa brings up a good point. Not so much about this episode, but emerging markets are potentially the places where sustainability solutions can actually be the profitable ones, because things like regenerative agriculture should be the focuses of investors because of how it increases the profitability of a region. So I found those things to be super cool.
Yeah, those are all super interesting to me as well. For me, the biggest things were, first of all, his idea at the beginning of putting a wall between the claims that VCs make about their startups versus what the startups themselves choose to say. And I think this is just interesting because there's that recent law in California. I don't know all the nuances about it, but it's about making claims and how you can actually have consequences to greenwashing and to kind of presenting yourself in a certain way. So it just seems like he's really ahead of the curve on that. And the second thing is, I was just really struck again by Zecca's presence. And I think it's clear when speaking to him that he's extremely well read. And that ended up actually coming up in our post show discussion. And it turns out he reads about 50 books a year or something, I noted. So, kind of just throughout this podcast and in life in general, I think it's notable when somebody reads a lot, you can usually tell. And maybe that's just something for all of us to take away. The third point is this idea of being profits first that we touched on towards the end. We didn't really dive too deep into it, but the reason this really has stood out to me is that working in recruitment for the past 4 years, we saw a huge rush into climate in 2020, 2021, and now things are relatively cool compared to that period. So it just appears that there's a lot of kind of chasing the money, at least within recruitment companies that I talk to. So this is the same sentiment that Chris Sacca has around kind of profit first. And my comment would be, let's all make sure that we focus on that so that working in climate is not just a fad, but rather kind of a constant. So those are my three big points.
And there we go. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Let me know how you liked this part of the show, and see you next time.